In 1956, as the tides of colonial rule began to recede, a new force was born upon Nigeria's waters, a small but determined naval arm tasked with defending the nation's coast and sovereignty. What began as a modest marine department fleet would, within a decade, transform into a proud symbol of independence and national power. From the Royal Navy's influence to the dawn of self-rule, the years between 1956 and 1966 shaped the identity, discipline, and destiny of the Nigerian Navy. It was a story of courage, transition, and ambition, set against the powerful currents of the young nation finding its place in the world. This is the story of how Nigeria took command of our own waters.
Hi guys, welcome to our first historic. On today's episode, we look at the history of the Nigerian Navy, its first equipment, its first recruits, and of course, its first court-martial. This is the history of the first decade of the Nigerian Navy. Do stay tuned and enjoy the ride.
The final decision to establish a naval force can be traced to the Colonial Secretary's Department to the House of Representatives on the 1st of March 1955, arising from the dissolution of the Marine Department into the Nigerian Ports Authority on the 1st of April 1955. Captain Francis William Scofield, the last director of the Colonial Marine Department, became the first expatriate to head the Navy when it was finally established in 1956. The Nigerian Navy that emerged in 1956 emerged from ideas of some of these Nigerian nationalists who were fighting for Nigeria's independence. Maritime Sule, for instance, he would like Nigeria to have, in quotes, a navy which can be justifiably proud and which is worthy of this great country. Jaja Wachuku was unhappy with the old Marine Department when he commented that, quote, "What do we see here? It is just the old Marine Department, changing name and nothing more," end of quote. And Sani asserted that, quote, "If we are to have a navy, we should not just have a nominal navy. The substructure of the navy should be quite strong to pave way for stronger superstructure," end of quote. G.O.D. Ene summed up the Nigerian aspiration, quote, "Without a strong navy, Nigeria will never hope to be a country worthy of its name on the continent of Africa," end of quote. Ozumba Mbadiwe stressed the necessity for having a navy and a strong army. The then Minister of Transport, Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, reiterated an insight into the decisions made in the policy paper when he gave the condition of the kind of the people who should work in the Nigerian Naval Service. He said the people who live mainly in the creeks and the Niger Delta areas were mostly accustomed to jobs in the littoral areas of Nigeria and would form a great percentage of the employed staff. Balewa established the fact that those of the littoral delta had been prominent as staff of the Marine Department, which was now the Nigerian Port Authority. Balewa agreed with men like Solaro on issues such as the cost of maintaining the armed forces. He asserted that, quote, "Navies cost a lot of money, and there is hardly any country that can produce sufficient funds for a navy." Despite this view of Balewa, nations like Japan, Russia, the United States, and Great Britain still consider the operations of the littoral forces necessary for their growth and would rather spend a large amount from their budget to support their navies. The new navy was a coastal navy in role and duty, and its inception. The Royal Navy, that is, the British Navy, would be the force that safeguarded Nigerian territorial waters against any external aggression in the colonial days. In layman's language, the Navy was established to protect these resources contained in Nigeria's littoral environment and to fend off any threat to them.
If you find this video worthwhile, please take us some time to smash a like and subscribe to the channel, as it goes a long way in supporting our efforts. Thank you. Now let's get back to the video.
Manpower development is a process that seeks to optimize an organization's usage of human resources. It requires an integrated approach that addresses multidimensional aspects of employees, ranging from enhancing technical and interpersonal skills to creative thinking and leadership. Naval platforms are the specific facilities which host and use equipment that has a particular military task that is needed in the theater of war. This applies to air, ground, water, and multi-environmental configurations, and one vehicle or facility will often act as a platform for several different categories of equipment and infrastructure. The colonial impact on infrastructure was exploitative. Although infrastructure can be described as the basic physical structures needed for operations of organizations, the Navy stated these littoral platforms as the Pathfinder, Petrel, Challenger, Chaser, Valiant, Frances, Trojan, Bischoff, Jade, Nymph, and Penelope. The first land infrastructural platform for any naval force is a naval base. The naval base was bought for £15,000 and was formally transferred back to the government with effect from April 1, 1957. In 1957, a base development plan was drawn indicating the sites for proposed jetty, spillways, workshops, and stores, also including buildings already being converted for use by the Naval Service. The architectural plan was favorably commented upon by the Commander-in-Chief, South Atlantic and South America, Ian Campbell, who was then in charge of Nigeria. The first installment of funds was voted for at its inception, and the plan was passed to the consulting engineers, Messrs. Code and Partners, London, to prepare the detailed architectural plan for the brand new naval base. The manpower was made available to the newly established Naval Service to work inside the base in 1956 was derived mainly from three organization sources, namely the Marine Department, the Nigerian Ports Authority, and the Inland Waterways. The officers were mostly made up of British personnel. It is worth remarking that apart from being employed in the marine environment, which exposed them to ships and harbor craft, port operations, and dockyard services, those Nigerians who formed the nucleus of the Nigerian ratings were not used to naval operations in the modern sense. However, coastal Nigerians had participated in small wars even before the coming of the Europeans. The total wars between the Ijalians and Ijaws easily comes in mind here. The manpower of the officer cadre were virtually all British expatriate staff, mostly retired Royal Navy personnel, or simply marine professionals. As part of the general reconstruction of the Nigerian Armed Forces before independence, an Act of Parliament was passed in 1958, which designated the Nigerian Naval Service as the Royal Nigerian Navy. This was to reflect the Independence Constitution, which recognized the British monarch as the head of state to be represented by the Governor General. However, the British began to train some Nigerian personnel in Kora under its new name of the Nigerian Navy Training Establishment, HMNS Kora, on the 1st of November 1957. The original Kora buildings were in Apapa Dockyard and were therefore vested in the Nigerian Ports Authority. In 1957, Kora 1, which had been converted to accommodation block, was fully completed and provided sleeping, messing and eating, and toilet facilities for 100 junior ratings. Kora 3, which comprised of a library or reading room and 3 lecture space, one of which was used as cinema and film projection room, was completed also in 1957. The training block, a new trading block which housed the commanding officer, the assistant training officer, and the instructors, was completed and occupied on 16 December 1957. The buildings known as Kora 1, Kora 3, and the training office block, all of which form a part of the HMNS Kora, the naval training establishment, were completed and occupied in November 1957. Although the training establishments could accommodate 100 junior ratings, the first intakes were 60 to ease the strain on the administration, as both the officers and 4 out of 6 instructors were new. The first intakes to be trained were divided between 3 organizations formed from the Nigerian Marine, the Nigerian Naval Force, the Inland Waterways Department, and the Nigerian Ports Authority. Included in the Nigerian Ports Authority entry were 4 engineer cadets and 4 deck cadets. All were expected to work within the Merchant Navy under the auspices of the joint scheme sponsored by the Nigerian Ports Authority and the leading shipping companies, with the exception of prospective Merchant Navy cadets who would only serve for 3 months. The basic course for all other junior ratings was 6 months. At the end of the 6 months, the junior ratings serving with the Inland Waterways Department and the Nigerian Ports Authority returned to their organizations, while the junior naval ratings were required to undergo a further 3 months training in purely naval subjects. All branches of the Navy undergoing basic course did extra 3 months, adopted only for the Nigerian Naval Service. HMNS Challenger was converted to an act as a seagoing tender to Kora, which could take up 20 ratings away for a short cruise along the Nigerian coast. Also added to the HMNS Challenger for the training of ratings at Kora was 27-feet sailing whalers, 2 gigs, 2 17-feet sailing dinghies, and a 17-feet motorboat, nymph, all attached for training purposes. The training of other organizations' personnel was indeed intentional and partly one of the ways proposed for the Navy to earn revenue for the colonial government. The Navy was expected to be a revenue earner and contribute to the coffers of the government, and as such, plans were put in place for it to achieve this objective. For the Navy to be a revenue earner, the Navy would train boys from the Nigerian Ports Authority, Merchant Navy, and other government institutions so as to enable it to collect fees to meet up with the cost of training its own boys. For the smooth administration of the naval service, a store and cost section was created in 1957. On April 1, 1957, the accounting department became self-accounting and auditing. The Hydrographic department is one of the oldest departments in the Nigerian Navy, and it was established to fulfill one of the roles of the naval service, that is, to produce charts for Nigeria's waterways. It was also charged with the publication of nautical information and data for the use of mariners. The staff deposition of officers working for the Hydrographic department was 9. As at 1957, the department was yet to have any dockyard or repair facilities. Hence, the refit of its vessels was to be done by external outfits. One of the naval ships, Pathfinder, was recommissioned in 1957 and was able to visit Bonny almost the same time. The department performed the following hydrographic survey works for the Nigerian Ports Authority between 1956 and 1958. Lagos Harbour, Imo River Entrance, Escravos River, Forcados River, Non River, Bimbia River, Burutu, and Benin River. Hydrographic survey work was also done for the Shell Darcy Petroleum Development Company in 1967 in Bonny and Calabar River, which was a series of oceanographical and meteorological observations carried out over 3 months with a view to find out how and why the bar at the entrance of the Bonny River formed and the weather that can be expected in the Bonny vicinity under the worst conditions, which occurred during the rains. In 1957, it was believed by the colonial government that the naval force could be operated at the minimal cost if revenue could be generated from ventures such as the vessel's attachment to the Hydrographic department. The Public Works Department erected security fences and gates in 1958. A canteen for use of the staff was completed in 1957, which provided food services for personnel of the naval service. It must be said that naval service, just like the Marine Department, was still being treated like a department before an act of the Parliament established a fully fledged naval force in 1958. In that same year, Captain Scuttle, the first director of service, retired from the force to be replaced by Kennedy in 1958. Improvements were also made to the inherited naval fleet during the period between 1956 and 1958. For instance, Valiant was completed by her builders, Messrs. Harrow & Co., Glasgow, and it arrived on July 8, 1957 on Nigerian shores. Valiant was specially designed for the use of the Governor General for official tours of the inspection on the rivers. Pathfinder was readjusted to enable it to receive her armament, a 40mm Bofors gun, and the provision of an additional accommodation for her crew was completed in 1957. Penelope was designed as a seagoing vessel and would be capable of working independently from the parent vessel Pathfinder. Penelope had accommodations for 2 surveying officers and 4 recorders in addition to the ship's complement. Penelope was stiffened forward to carry a 40mm Bofors gun and strengthened and suitable fender to be used as an armed boarding vessel in connection to the port examination service in time of war. Although the vessel was primarily a seagoing vessel, her design also enabled Penelope to use inland waterways if necessary to allow for constabulary duties. The first naval training ship was the Challenger. The Challenger was adopted for the new role of a seagoing tender to the training establishment Kora. By May 1959, the Royal Nigerian Navy has begun to expand its fleet and shore facilities. The new naval base, known as the HMNS Bischoff, was established in 1960, while 6 ships were further transferred to the Royal Nigerian Navy by the Royal Navy. The HMS Harry was transferred by the Royal Navy to the Nigerian Navy and renamed the HMS Nigeria. Among the 6 ships transferred to the HMS Nigeria were HMS Kaduna, HMS Calabar, and HMS Sapele, all seaworld defense motor launches. These ships joined HMS Pathfinder, a survey vessel, HMS Challenger, a motor launch, HMS Penelope, another survey vessel, HMS Valiant, the Governor General's official yacht. All were previously inherited from the Nigerian Marine. At the end of 1960, the Royal Nigerian Navy started with the following Nigerian naval officers. On the executive branch, Lieutenant Nelson Bosman Soro was the only Nigerian officer. In the engineering branch, the Navy had Lieutenant Nathaniel Percy, Lieutenant Edet Akinwale Ware, and Warrant Engineer Officer Kuka. In the supply branch were Lieutenant Akinloye, Chiazo, Second Lieutenant Duyile, Martin, and Oni. The rest of the officers were retired Royal Navy officers. The Indian Navy training team joined in 1962. As a matter of fact, the total number of expatriate officers serving with the Royal Nigerian Navy was 24. Most of the foreign officers were now staff officers, and a few assigned to training duties. Gradually, the number reduced, and by the end of 1964, most ships came under the command of Nigerians. The force since 1957 had been engaged in massive recruitment of Nigerian citizens into the service, but this did not bear fruit until 1960, when more Nigerians began to join the Navy. The Nigerian Navy was also involved in Nigeria's diplomatic role with the Cameroons in 1960. In order to maintain Nigeria's territorial sovereignty over South Cameroon, which was part of Nigeria, HMS Harry was assigned the duty of transporting soldiers of the Nigerian Army and officers. Naval officers and Army officers met on board the HMS Nigeria and shared their peculiar organizational experiences. On the ship were men such as the lieutenants of the Army, Jack Gowon, Michael Evenson, Patrick Amadi, and Gabriel Koweze. On 23rd February 1960, there was a ship's exercise off Victoria, Cameroon. On December 1st, 1960, Lieutenant Soro took over command of the HMS Kaduna. He took over the command of the ship from Lieutenant Nelson Walton, thereby making him, that is, Lieutenant Soro, the first Nigerian that took over command of a naval ship. However, the problem with the Cameroons was resolved diplomatically. Eventually, on February 11th and 12th, 1961, a plebiscite was held in the British Cameroons to determine the wishes of the inhabitants of Northern Cameroon and Southern Cameroon. The population of Northern Cameroon voted to join Northern Nigeria, while the population of Southern Cameroon voted to join the Republic of Cameroon. On September 30th, 1960, at about 11:59 p.m., it was a naval rating ordinary seaman, Akanor, who brought down the British Union Jack, a symbol declaring Nigeria as independent. Even though the Navy was a small size, a naval rating was given the honorable duty, which was generally accepted within military circles that when it came to such ceremonials, the Navy was looked upon as the best for parade ceremony. The Royal Navy, for instance, has always been at the forefront during parades in Britain. Thus, the choice of a naval rating was not regarded as an anomaly. The officer who led the ceremonial parade to usher in Nigeria's independence was Lieutenant Onwurah Chiazo. Chiazo was the first ADC to Nigeria's Governor General, Nnamdi Azikiwe. A court-martial is a trial in the military court for a member of the armed forces who is charged with breaking a military law. Court-martials have jurisdiction over people subject to military service and in war. The court-martial trials are lawfully provided in the armed forces and as an act of disciplinary tool in the armed forces. The Nigerian Navy court-martial rules came into force on April 1, 1962. The court-martial rules prescribe the procedure whereby a person desiring to appeal to the Federal Supreme Court against his conviction by a court-martial may give notice of appeal. The first naval officers involved and indicted in the court-martial were Commander Akinloye, Lieutenant Commander Chiazo, and Lieutenant Samuel Diyule. Onwurah Chiazo joined the Nigerian Navy from the Canadian Navy. He was persuaded by the Nigerian government to join the Nigerian Naval Force. He was not from the Old Marine or any other Nigerian organization. He was trained in the Royal Canadian Navy, where he had his Queen Commission in 1956. Chiazo was the first Nigerian to be the 33rd Commission as an officer in the Nigerian Navy. He was a sub-lieutenant in the Royal Canadian Navy in 1957. On August 21, 1958, the officer became the first African to be accepted for training at the Royal Navy for a sub-tech course. Joseph Edet Akinwalewe, who became the first Nigerian Chief of Naval Staff, was commissioned in 1958. Chiazo traveled to Canada in 1943 as a stowaway. His mission was to become a medical doctor at the University of Manitoba. The fact still remained that he was serving on board the Royal Canadian Naval flagship when the Nigerian government, through the Governor General Nnamdi Azikiwe, requested he came back to Nigeria to help build the Nigerian Navy. In 1958, Dr. Dennis Osadebe, a prominent politician, visited Canada and encouraged him to come back home and join the Nigerian Navy, which he did. Chiazo was court-martialed and found guilty for failing to comply with the Commodore's Temporary Memorandum No. 188, dated 28 May 1963 and 252, dated 31st December 1963. Three officers, Commander Akinloye, Lieutenant Commander Chiazo, and Lieutenant Samuel Diyule, were charged with misappropriation of naval funds. This incident could be regarded as the Navy's first major controversy after independence. All the officers were dismissed, and within the Navy, a lot of uproar among officers was provoked by the court-martial. The officers protested their treatment to the Federal Court of Appeal to claim their innocence. Rotimi Williams, assisted by Abraham Adesoya, stood the appeal for the petitioners. The Federal Court of Appeal dismissed 4 counts and held up 2 counts. These 2 counts were on negligence. The court-martial brought up all sorts of insinuations of ethnic or deliberate organizational intention to ruin the careers of the 3 officers. However, this was dismissed outrightly by such men such as Sub-Lieutenant Akin Aduwo, who later became Chief of Naval Staff in 1980. He said, quote, "I was at their court-martial. It was not as if they wanted to ruin their career because he is Igbo or Yoruba. There was nothing like tribalism. The ship had comradeship." End of quote. In fact, for people like Aduwo, the Navy was an obscure force just known for mostly Southerners. For him, there was nothing like tribalism or sectionalism within the Navy. Aduwo, commenting among the relationship among officers, described it as, quote, as one that was cordial and having a sense of comradeship. And so there was no problem among officers. There was a dispute by Chiazo. For him, naval officers had tribal loyalties like their political paymasters. Also, there were divisions along career recruitment lines. That is, those who were recruited from the old marine versus those that did not come from the old marine. Chiazo in particular attributed this to why he was dismissed from the Navy in 1964. The Navy was devoid of problems, such as hatred from the Nigerian people, as was the case of the Nigerian Army. The Army was seen as an oppressive tool because of the role it played during the colonial period. The Navy until 1980 was unable to attract enough Northerners to join it. According to Aduwo, quote, Sokoto State had no naval officer until 1980. This imbalance in favor of the South in the early recruitments of the Navy did not come to haunt the institution as it was with the Army. In the case of the Nigerian Army, it was part of the reasons that the nation fell into a civil war. In 1964, Commodore Edet Akinwalewe became the first indigenous Nigerian officer to become the Chief of Naval Staff. He was then the most senior Nigerian naval officer. He took over from Rear Admiral Kennedy, a British officer. It was an appointment Aduwo described as, quote, an aberration but intentionally made only to satisfy politicians. For Aduwo, Ware was an engineering officer and should not have been made the Chief of Naval Staff. Navies all over the world were controlled administratively by the executive group or the seamen, so they are expected to become the commanding officers of their ships, and as such, the Chief of Naval Staff. The peculiar Nigerianization situation of 1964 allowed this position to be given to an engineering officer, something which would most unlikely in the later period of the 20th century. However, the choice of Ware was popular with the politicians. The politicians were not ready to draw into issues of who really was appropriate to command the Navy. Admiral Ware commanded the Navy from 1964 to 1973. Prior to 1966, the British government withdrew Royal Navy ships, which were on a long-term lease, to the Nigerian government. Among the withdrawn ships was the country's only frigate, HMS Nigeria, the former HMS Harry. The Royal Nigerian Navy placed order for a new flagship for Nigeria in 1962 with the Dutch shipbuilding yard of Wilton Fienoord in Schiedam, Holland. The Dutch government decided to present the Queen Wilhelmina, which was in their reserve fleet, to the Nigerian government. This was to help the Royal Nigerian Navy to train her officers and men prior to the commissioning of the new frigate, NNS Nigeria. The commissioned Queen Wilhelmina became NNS Ogoja and immediately became the new flagship. For a replacement of HMS Nigeria, the country's purchase for the Wilton Fienoord. The country purchased from the Wilton Fienoord of Holland the frigate also called Nigeria. The ship was commissioned on 21st September 1965. It was bought for £3.5 million. In addition to the acquisition of the new NNS Nigeria, the Navy acquired two additional old seaworld defense boats, SDBs, namely NNS Benin and NNS Ibadan, from Vickers Shipyard in the United Kingdom on 1st July 1966. Apart from the new SDB, NNS Enugu, ordered new for the Navy in 1960. Nigerian naval ships consisted of old ex-Royal Navy ships and NNS Ogoja, an old ex-US naval patrol boat handed to the Nigerian Navy by the Royal Dutch Navy as part of the procurement of the Nigerian Navy's first frigate, NNS Nigeria, on order from the Dutch shipyard in 1964. NNS Ogoja was a covert with a length of 185 feet, carrying the following armament: 1x3 gun, 4x40mm Bofors, 6x4mm Olicons, and AS equipment. NNS Enugu was also an SDB, with a length of 110 feet, carrying an armament of 1x40mm Bofors and AS equipment. NNS Sapele and NNS Calabar were trained in Outlook. They were minesweeping motor launches with a length of 112 feet and carrying an armament of 2x20mm Olicons and minesweeping gear. NNS Challenger was a patrol motor launch carrying an armament of 1x40 Bofors. NNS Penelope was a survey vessel. Its length was 79 feet and carried an armament of 1x40 Bofors. The first and only land craft before 1966 was NNS Lokoja. Its length was 188 feet and it carried an armament of 2x20 Olicons. Nigeria did not buy any of these ships. Prior to 1966, naval officers had a cordial working relationship with the politicians who were at the helm of affairs. The relationship between officers and their political masters was based purely on professionalism. This working link between the politicians and the naval personnel, however, related to loyalty from the officers and sometimes jealousy and envy. All of this became apparent within the internal structures of the Navy and Army during the two coups of 1966. The Navy did not play a major role during the coups but supported their Army counterparts by endorsing the two military administrations.
Thanks for watching the video, guys. I would really love to know your thoughts about the history of the Nigerian Navy in its first decade. Please let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Don't forget to smash a like and subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification button to get more content like this about African history. It's been Nan from Africa's Historic. See you in the next one.